You're listening to the Vent Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vent Podcast. My name is Brady. I am without Billy Galenko, although I am back from 4 or 5 weeks off of the podcast while we were growing our family. So that was exciting, but Billy was solo, and now I'm solo for 2 weeks while he travels. And so we'll be back together here towards the end of the month, and we look forward to being back in studio to bring you guys more exciting episodes. But today I'm introing an interview that we did with actually another whiskey brand, which we haven't done too many spirits brands so far on the podcast, but we're trying to bring a little bit more of that to the table. If you recall, we've had our friends from Found North, as well as Highwire Revival Distillery in Charleston, South Carolina, on, along with a few other personalities from around the bourbon and Scotch whiskey space. So check out some of those past episodes. But today on the podcast, we have our friend Peter Nevenglosky, who, along with acclaimed restaurateur and his friend Pablo Moy, started the brand Rare Character amidst the pandemic in 2020. So Rare Character is an independent bottler of American whiskeys, bourbons, and ryes, especially across a number of different labels. Really interesting product offering, and Peter will talk through some of those labels. But he actually sent us over their Fortuna bourbon, which is a brand that they're sort of bringing back and reimagining it today. It closed its doors in the 1960s, but was sort of started up in the late 1880s. And so Fortuna whiskey, a sour mash whiskey, we actually got to try that here on the podcast, and so we'll talk about that a little bit. It's one of their sort of foundational labels, I'll call it. They plan to release it seems like every year. Aside from that, they, I think, really cut their teeth in terms of becoming sort of a cult favorite, especially among whiskey enthusiasts online, and who've sort of spread the word about this label through their single barrels series. And so these single barrel whiskeys are often selected by restaurants or liquor stores, or other hospitality venues, or even whiskey societies who will select a barrel along with Rare Character and do a private bottling with them. And so these single barrels can be found in some places online, but they're typically fairly limited releases that will come directly from that partner. Each barrel, I should say, is selected by Pablo, Pete's partner, and they're mainly sourcing these whiskeys from legacy producers, barrels that maybe are a little bit outside the run-of-the-mill, trying to find depth of character, no pun intended, depth of flavor and interest in these single barrels that you might not get from the legacy producers. So that's the idea behind the single barrel series. We also got to taste a selection from that series, but Peter will walk us through the core lineup at Rare Character, provide some insight into their process and approach to selecting whiskey and what it takes to build a whiskey brand from the ground up, especially as an independent bottler. Sort of this balance between maintain high quality of the releases, maintain some level of scarcity and demand, especially for their most limited whiskeys that they bring in. Scarcity, exclusivity is certainly a part of the label, but I think even more so, sort of self-expression, the singularity of each of these labels is most important. And so we'll get to hear Peter talk through that journey, tell us a little bit about the whiskeys in their portfolio, and hopefully you'll be inspired to go and try something from Rare Character. So without further ado, here is our interview with Pete Nevenglosky. Hey, Pete. Thanks so much for joining.
Good to be here.
Yeah, this is great. Among the whiskey producers, whiskey brands that we've had on, you're in small company right now as we grow that list of folks. So we're glad that you could be one of the early whiskey producers on the podcast.
Right on. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and your project first came across you guys dredging the internet whiskey forums, right?
Yeah.
r/whiskey and other places where people do reviews and find these great labels, and came across you guys and saw that you're doing multiple different labels, different projects, finishing casks, sourcing single barrels, and all kinds of stuff. Tell us, what is Rare Character? What do you guys do? What's the bread and butter? How did it start?
Yeah, totally. We are independent bottlers of American whiskey, really inspired by the Scotch tradition. So Gordon MacPhail, Duncan Taylor, Samaroli, like truly great bottlings over there. And we felt like there really wasn't much of that going on in the US. And so it's myself and my partner, Pablo Moy. So we just both passionate spirits, consumers, lovers, etc., and got to know each other. I had launched a cachaça brand called Bavla in 2013, launched it in New York, built that up over time, literally like staying on people's couches, rolling bags, trying to talk to people about cachaça in November. I met Pablo. He's a great restaurateur in LA. He's got a spot Scopa. Within that, he has Old Lightning. So great palate, huge collector. And we became close just from selling him this stuff and becoming friends over the years. And we had the opportunity with a little bit of time on our hands in the middle of the pandemic where I had brands that are very bar restaurant focused and he had bars and restaurants where had a little more time and this idea of celebrating American whiskey came up. So it has been through many iterations. And we do a few things. You mentioned the single barrel series, right? This is an example I have on me. This was the first thing that we started. A lot of people know us for that, which is a rotating menu of different bourbons, rye, unique finishes, unique native woods from South America, et cetera. And they're all customized visually and selected with accounts, whether they're bars or retailers or clubs or what have you. And it's a vehicle for us we just find great things. It's really all Pablo seeking out, using relationships and seeking out phenomenal whiskey. The concept was inspired by maybe a bit of when the whiskey universe started its resurgence, right? Julian Van Winkle with 15-year-old plus Stitzel Weller still wasn't finding quite the audience. Customization of labeling and unique offerings were a part of finding ways to sell it, right? So that was that. And we launched that in December 2021. So we're a pretty young company, but I like to say we're a startup that's not a startup because we've got decades of experience in Bev Alc and collecting and all this stuff. And then we revived this brand Fortuna, which I'm sure we'll get into. I think you guys have it. We do something called the Exceptional Series. And most recently have put out Brook Hills. It's really a wide array of things that we do, which is a lot of fun. It's a lot of things to have done in 2 years. But I think people really
How did you personally get into the spirit space? And cachaça is really cool, very different from bourbon, but how did you get into it in general?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I was living in New York, came from a marketing background, but I had great bars around me, befriended a number of cool bartenders who shared a lot of unique spirits with me. So I got exposed to cachaça amongst other things in that, and then ended up in Brazil and was amazed at the diversity of the categories. 5,000 producers there. It's a 500-year-old category. So just was an interesting side project that took up steam, and I ended up just pulling the ripcord on corporate world, and that set me into a world of spirits. The next thing I launched was an aquavit in 2019, and I have a tequila now called Paladar and such. So just really love telling stories of different people and their production and putting out great juice. It's always about the product really first and foremost with anything that I'm a part of.
I guess that comes through in just the sheer number of labels that you have across the portfolio, and how you said each of these single barrels are kind of sort of like custom art pieces as well. There's a unique label selected by, there's a different name on every one because they're selected by a retailer or a club or something like that. How much does the storytelling that's inherent to the uniqueness of each label, but also the exclusivity that comes with producing in such a limited run, how much do those two things play into how you think about the brand?
Yeah, I would say we think about each one fairly individually. When we think about Single barrel series, it's about, say, 6 to 8, maybe 9-year-old whiskey. Traditionally, that can be at a price point that we think is fair and viable, right? We always pride ourselves on, you open a bottle of ours and hopefully you think that was a great product for the price you paid for it, right? And that provides a lot of leeway to say we can buy from Kentucky and Tennessee and Indiana, and we can buy some pretty quirky things that maybe other people don't think makes sense in a business perspective, right? So we're not just doing one thing with one profile. We're saying, hey, this is delicious. It's interesting. It's got a fun story. And we could charge a price that we think makes sense for what that is, right? The way that it delivers in that way. But that may mean we buy lots as small as 5 barrels of a type, right? It's really just comes down to what's available. So when you look at that, if you look at some of our higher end stuff like the Exceptional series or even Brook Hill, these are just really beautiful barrels. And there aren't that many of those. And they are by nature pretty low yield barrels, right? You pay a lot of money for not a lot of output, but they're really good. And so I wouldn't say it's much of a strategy as that's just the reality, right? Sometimes we get the opportunity to buy 10 insane barrels and that's it. That's all there is. You're not going to build a brand off of them, but that's what you got, right? Or even less, or who knows, right? So for us, that's how that plays. And then each kind of component of what we do has a different mandate, right? Fortuna is Kentucky bourbon from the same place to evoke this profile of the old brand, right? It was started in the late 1800s by a gentleman named Phil Hollenbach, distilled by the Snitzel brothers. So he contracted with them. These guys created the modern racking system, progenitors of Snitzel Weller, right? Really beautiful story and a really unique profile, which Pablo tried to match as close as he could when tasting it, right? So in this case, with the 102 you have, it's a 6-year minimum, 6-barrel blend at 102 proof to evoke that. The package is almost identical to that. When it comes to Fortuna or the barrel proof iteration, there's a profile we look for. There's an archetype roughly that fits in, right? Single barrel series can be anything we find compelling and delicious and that makes sense to sell in a barrel format, right? Somebody who's buying it is buying 150, 180, 130, whatever bottles of it. We don't want to sell those for $400 a bottle. It doesn't make sense. Then when you get to things like Brook Hill, this is the 1% barrel. So this is a product that is really like those just gems, like insane barrels that just the most beautiful expressions of those. When we find those, and they're straight bourbons and straight rye, but they're not necessarily from one place or one age statement or one thing like that. But if you see Brook Hill, if you find Brook Hill, good luck, maybe. It's going to be fantastic, right? It's going to be really at a beautiful level. So that's how these kind of things stay within each brand. And then you have Pride. You can go on forever, I guess. It's crazy. But you have Pride of Anderson County, which is a collaboration with the Russells and Wild Turkey, very limited, beautiful cast strength, specially selected barrels. That's obviously Wild Turkey juice, right? So that's the mandate. Bourbons and ryes from Wild Turkey of significant age at cast strength in single barrels.
Yeah, it sounds like, to me, it sounds like this idea that you wouldn't linger on one profile for too long is an important part of the lineup. I know, I guess, Fortuna, and you're trying to keep a relatively consistent expression. You're not trying to develop a house style among your picks. Is that correct?
So again, if you think about, let's go back to Gordon MacPhail, it's just things that are beautiful that are interesting, right? There's not a specific thing that we do. It's all American whiskey, right? That's the mandate.
Yeah, right.
It's almost exclusively legacy produced. I'm a craft spirits guy, but we just feel really strongly about there's something about the time that's put in to a lot of these multi-generational distilleries that really beautiful things come out of them, right? But then beyond that, different mash bills, something was distilled here, but then aged here, and that makes it interesting. So I think one of you guys got a Rio single barrel code. That's MGP 75214, but it aged entirely at the old Taylor warehouse, which is now Castle and Key, which is entirely brick and stone. And thus it has crazy airflow, right? So it's extremely different than what we put out with Neo, which is basically distilled in Indiana, same mash bill, almost the same age, but stayed in Indiana. Wildly different, right? So we like to find and tell those stories. And again, when eventually those are going to be gone, we've got another handful of those coming out. They'll be 8-year, but then that's it, because nothing else was from that time, done at that time, and then went to Castle Key, right? So then Rios are done, never to be seen again from us. But
yeah,
we'll find something else that's really interesting and has a great story.
Somebody who manages Scotch casks this morning, and I think it's so interesting on the bourbon side, the story of where it ages and that airflow, since it's such a compressed timescale compared to some of these scotches, is so important. I don't think people really think about that as much. Can you explain like a little difference between, say, the high airflow and a Castle and Key type place versus like another that would be polar opposites, and how that impacts the flavor profile?
And I think starting with Scotch is a good point, right? Because you have, one, obviously the base material is different, but two, in terms of temperature and climate change, it's much less significant swing. So what's happening in Kentucky is it gets very hot and humid, and it gets very cold and dry, and you go through these things. So what's wild to see is if you have a facility with good airflow, which is part of this, right? But the difference between something you can taste in February, you taste it again in August, it's wildly different, right? Like shockingly different. And so that's pretty exciting, right? I think that, yes, again, different base material, but different temperature changes. I've heard something like, for example, in cachaça, that the aging happens 3 times faster because of the heat, humidity, and temperature change, right? And then you get into nuances. Is it bottom floor or top floor of a large rickhouse? And what's the airflow? And but really, a lot of that magic happens when it gets hot and humid, and you get the expansion and contraction. And that does a lot to American whiskey if it's in the right place. And by the same token, if it's in the wrong place and it's not experiencing as much of that, you're probably keeping more yield, but you're getting way less interesting whiskey. So unfortunately, from an economic standpoint, maximizing yield usually doesn't maximize the flavor profile.
Eventually allow those things that are maximizing yield to eventually seep in? Or is it that flow of in and out, that expansion and the contraction of the wood that...
I don't know that I'm sufficiently an expert to answer that. I think everything is aging and experiencing that in various degrees. But look, I don't know, just anecdotally, I've had some 5 years that taste significantly more rounded, beautiful, interesting, wood integrated than a 9-year. I think there's many components that go into that. In the realm of spirits, while bourbons are traditionally much younger than scotches, almost nothing else is aged in that kind of quantity of time other than you talk about cognacs and armagnacs and such. Most things are aged for 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, call it a day, right? So you're still talking about a significant amount of time in barrel. And that impact of the life journey of that time in barrel is going to change significantly depending on where you put it, right? Even at 6 years.
And are you guys managing some of your own like secondary cask finishing as well?
We do all of that.
Projects?
Yeah, we do all of that. So this one, for example, is a cognac finished bourbon that we did for St. Regis and W and Aspen. So Pablo does all these things. We basically buy our own secondary casks from brokers of various types. We do a lot of different iterations, really finding like best combination of mash bill and finish and time to finish, because finishing is very tricky. The way we do finishing is in the Scotch style again. So no charging. We're not leaving anything in. We're not using 2-year-old whiskey. We're using 6 and 7-year-old whiskey and finishing it, right? We believe that's the best way to do it. And then it really depends on what the product is as to how long it'll take, et cetera, on that side, you know?
Yeah, I think that's something that is really starting to catch on more, and maybe producers like Angel's Envy have made this more palatable
just this idea of just finishing in general with bourbon. We see it a lot with rye whiskey. We see it with some other spirits to a greater degree. I feel like bourbon has been a little bit slow to come on to really like getting a little bit more creative with the types of finishing casks that are used. So yeah, I appreciate that work. What are some of the casks that you've been most excited about to work with in terms of trying to imbue some added complexity of these bourbons?
Yeah, I would say just a caveat to that. I think what happens and challenges people who are like, hey, I only like straight bourbon is that if you have poorly made anything, if you have bad tequila, you think the category is bad. That's not necessarily true. There are people who are doing finishing who are taking young whiskey and they're dumping stuff in it. Like we have this maple series, right? And there's some maples out there. They're basically people just dumping maple syrup in young whiskey. Yeah. That's not going to taste good. It's certainly not going to taste like a complex finished spirit. I'm not naming any names, but when we do this, so I'm excited about this to answer that question. When we do these, we take a barrel that had maple for a year from an Ohio artisanal producer. All the maple syrup was removed. It's then the interaction with the whiskey and what's left in that barrel. So it's the extraction of that. So what's cool about this is that you get some of those elements, but it's not like pancakes, right? You're getting rounding, but it's a whiskey first. It's always a philosophy for us. It's got to be a whiskey first. It's not if we're finishing in white port, it shouldn't taste like white port. It should taste like a whiskey that has rounding and complexity out of those things. So others that I'm excited about, I'm a huge fan of Amburana. I started with that in 2013 with Avois. It's a Brazilian wood, really unique. We've done a few others that we've gotten from our producer down there, barrels, and experimented with those. Love Madeira, love white port, tawny port. Some of the sherries are really fun, right? So there's a lot of fun stuff out there. We've gotten some Foursquare casks of rum, which is fantastic. That's a really fun finish. And then it's also like, we really like certain ryes are great for finishing, as are high rye bourbons, right? Where you can really get the combination of some of the sweetness factors and complexity, but it's a nice dry experience. You're not putting sweet on sweet, right? So it's really about thinking about the right mash bill and the right finishing barrel, and then the right amount of time that whiskey sits in that finishing barrel, because if it's not enough, it's not interesting. If it's too much, it's terrible, right? You go too far,
is basically nothing. Is it Adorana? I'm not great at pronouncing it. Amburana. What type of flavor profile for something that's spent time in that wood?
I'd say cinnamon, baking spice, nutmeg. Again, there's nothing added, but it's a wood and a teak family. So it's got a really unique kind of fall spice characteristic that's just very interesting. So it's if you love it, you love it. If it's not for you, it's not for you.
I think that's actually how I ran across you guys, was a conversation about that particular finishing, and of the names that kind of came up when who's doing this stuff. Rare Character came up, and there was that exact conversation. It was like, I hated it, I loved it, but that's almost exactly what you want when you're doing something like that. So looking forward to trying that one day.
Yeah, I think it's delicious. I'm like an unpaid global brand ambassador for Amburana. The challenge with Amburana, though, is if you do it wrong, it's another one of those. If you do it wrong, it's really not good, right? So you got to be very good about it. But yeah, look, we like to throw things against the wall and see what sticks and have fun. As long as we think the brief is it has to be delicious. If it's not delicious, we don't release it. There's a lot of barrels we pass on. There's a lot of barrels that we might get in hand that when they're not ready, we don't sell them in places where others may. And that's not the most economically viable way to do it. But it also, I think that when you open these bottles,
let's get into this Fortuna here that we have. I think
let's get into it.
Too. We have your Fortuna label, Sour Mash Kentucky Straight Bourbon, 102 proof.
That's right.
I poured some neat here.
I have a plastic glass because I'm sitting outside of a bar here on top of a bar called Oak and Ivy in Las Vegas. out of being a ran long, so I'm here. But
Yeah, and so this one, did you say just over 6 years? Is that right?
correct. Yeah, 6 years, 6-barrel blend of Kentucky bourbon. I can't tell you where it's from. The internet will probably tell you, but I cannot.
Lot of arguing I saw on some of that.
It's fun. It's funny, man.
I drink a lot of whiskey. I'm not quite good at picking out what mash bills from where, but
yeah, look, it's legacy produced. It's a sour mash, as you guys can tell from the package.
Yep.
It's the limestone shelf. It's column distilled. It's just good bourbon, right? And the aim with this is to get as close as we could. The pack is almost identical to the way it looked back in the day, barring changes we had to do for the TTB. The juice itself is as close to the dusty old bottles that we got our hands on.
Yeah.
Here's guys.
Yeah, to me, it like actually presents like really young and alive and like floral and even some minerality there to me. But then on the finish gets a little like tastes a little bit more mature in my mind. That some of that like funk or like dusty character that you're mentioning, which I just thought was really interesting. And 6 years, like, I think when you first taste it, you think it's like really young. But then as
I
it
was
goes
going to
on, like I
ask,
said,
I guess
it
you
feels
can't
like it gets
say
some more
exactly
age.
what the mash bill is if that gives away too much, but it did have more spice to me than a lot of bourbons, and I really liked the profile. I've got more complexity and a longer finish than I did on some. So I don't know if that was coming from the sour mash bill, if that's something that, that process imparts, or if it's just the sour mash, or if it was the mash bill itself. Mm-hmm.
I think it's the part of it is the blend. The reality is what is a misnomer is that most things that you guys might have are sour mash. It's simply an implication of the fermentation process. But look, it is very intentionally to get you to get a kind of dusty, spicy profile, right? That's the aim. But also to be something that's very drinkable, right? 102 as in between proofs. Look, pretty much everything else, I think with the exception of some barrels we've done for bars is all at cask strength, and that's great. But sometimes you want to just relax and you don't want to get your ass kicked. So it's enough where you get a really nice profile out of it. There's something there, but it's not dominating. So we think about it as just a good bourbon. It's very sessionable with kind of a unique profile, maybe some of that cinnamon spice on the back end, some of that dustiness that you might get there.
Yeah, for sure. And I always love the bottles that add the tax strip. You're trying to be authentic to the, it's just really neat. So because like you said, the story and the aesthetic and all of that like matters for these labels, especially when you're trying to revive something and revive the idea of something that has been a legacy in American whiskey. So I definitely appreciate the whole package of it.
Cool. Thanks, man.
And we have the Beer Zombies single barrel.
You guys have two different ones, I think, right? What do you got over there?
We have a different one.
What is it? Can I see it?
Backwards in the camera. Yeah.
Who selected it? Did it say Rocksteady? Oh, that's a good one. Cool. Yeah. So look, we've done hundreds of single barrels now. We do a lot of these. We can't keep up necessarily. They're all different. Obviously, the artwork. So Beer Zombies is a high rye bourbon, the one you have. From MGP, it's 60% corn, 36 rye, 4% malted barley. It's a classic high rye mash bill. Everybody loves it. Not everybody doesn't love anything, but it's very popular, I've found, because it's really like solid and palatable for just anybody who's just starting to get into whiskey. And it's also interesting enough for people who've been deeper into it. I think it's 6 years and change on that one. Beer Zombies is a brewer / they have bars in Vegas. They've got some spirits on the bar and collaboration with them. We actually got another one coming soon for that. That sold out pretty instantaneously other than what they have at the bars. What do you think of that?
Yeah, that was good to know the mash bill there on it being like a high rye, because on the nose you get so much of that like baking spice, cinnamon.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate that element in the Fortuna. Like you said, you get some of that baking spice on the back end, but to get it on the nose, I think is super inviting for me. I drink a lot of rye and it handles the proof really well. 117 is usually for me like 111 to 120, like in there is really good. And I thought it was like a perfect proof for it.
Cool. And then the Rios, I think I mentioned. So Rios are 75, 21, 4. classic mash bill. But what's so unique about that is, again, where it aged, which is the Brick and Stone warehouse, biggest, oldest warehouse in Kentucky, which what's now Castle and Key. So crazy airflow. So I think try that one out, but you'll probably get a really nice rounded profile out of it and a lot of texture and body. It's pretty popular.
I had some right
release
before
that we do in that series.
Doing the recording. And I think that's really spot on. And it opened up a little bit. I tried 2 different versions, one couple, like literally 3 drops of water just to see if it opened up more and even more. And it both ways are it's really, really great. So are you saying on the back, the 75 is corn, 21, is that wheat or is that rye? Rye. And then the 4 is wheat or barley? More the barley because it has to start cool. Not the fermentation, but the enzymes. Cool. Yeah, no, I thought it was really interesting. And it's also cool to know where it comes from. We actually visited Castle and Key while we were down there. So it's interesting to be able to put this in a place. But what I really like is the depth of that story there, because I thought all the information would just be here. And then I'm a member of the Scotch Whiskey Society and some other things, and I'm really like learning more about bourbon in the past couple of years. And I like how you have some of these things that you're able to kind of like compare side by side. It's like what you guys are offering, and each one has its own character. And I think to exactly your point, the US didn't have this, and I didn't really know it existed until I came across you guys and Brady brought you up as well. So I think it's really interesting.
Right on. Yeah, no, and look, that's a good point. So on the back of these labels all look the same, essentially same story. And then you'll see the mash bill on the back, but you won't really and then you'll see where it was distilled. But beyond that, a lot of that information is either told by us or we put out on some of either our Instagram or some of the groups. We've got a couple fan groups that people created. We'll put some more information there in terms of getting that out. And it's a bit of it's not intentional, but it's a little bit because we can't do a new label for every single release that we have. And also we can't always print what we might verbalize about something, right?
Yeah.
Or hint at or what have you. So yeah, that is a lot of the fun. And then it becomes fun. You're like, oh, I love Rio and I want to start collecting the Rio series, or I love the high rye stuff. So I want to get HR7s and HRYs and et cetera, et cetera. So it gives you a place to hide
the
on
Rio
what you're
and
interested in
Rocksteady
put out.
Nice.
Rio is just a barrel code. Pablo picked it. Rocksteady's the person who did the pick. Like Beer Zombies, for example. So Rocksteady is a different partner of ours who did this barrel. This is an extra that we add to send you guys to check out,
really
essentially.
Appreciate that. I have to say, how do most people like find you guys? Is it really just hardcore bourbon people, or are they going through these partners and getting in through like those rabbit holes?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Because you're like, Brook Hill, 100 bottles released.
Yeah, you can't find it. Dude,
Obliteration, 39.
Yeah. Yeah, Obliteration is I don't even have one, dude, on Obliteration. One, it's me and Hell Hostage. I may never get it. Yeah, no, it's interesting. A lot of it is we'll do barrels with retail partners and clubs and things like that. And we've got a wait list of people. So people interested can get in touch with us and get on the list. And hopefully we get to them in decent order. And
yeah,
a lot of the things that we're only in, it can stretch it 15 states at this point. So we're not everywhere. You can find some things online and get it shipped when they come out. Most of them don't stick around very long. We're making our way out, opening new states as we go. And I think one thing that will happen that will hopefully be a little more available is putting out some limited releases, which would be batch products, bourbons and ryes and maybe a couple of fun things. We'll go out and be a little bit larger quantity. Most of what we do it's not significant amount of any one thing. So it goes where it goes and gets scooped up by people. And, there's people on these groups who buy from other people and get it shipped. And it's a very active community, which is a lot of fun.
Exactly. Yeah. I was going to say, what element of the portfolio is the stickiest with your customers? Is it like Fortuna, where that's going to be consistent? They know what they're getting. It's similar label or similar juice each time, or these single barrels where people are chasing them and exploring each different
Everybody
expression.
wants a barrel, and they want too many barrels. We can't keep up. We've got a wait list like 1,000 people deep with barrel buyers. And so that's a huge component. But again, because it's so limited, right? Like we had a yield that was like in the 60 bottles for a barrel, right? So that went to a state. So Kentucky got a bourbon and a rye, but they got collectively 170 bottles between both of them. So that's for the state. Just by the nature of how many of those that meet that quality standard, there's not a lot out there. So we hear a lot about Brook Hill. It's only 2 months old. Gone insane. It's already been on Sotheby's. One bottle sold for $1,400.
Yeah,
for a Life of Lux bourbon, which is pretty ridiculous. It's fun. It's exciting. Look, if you buy Brook Hill at MSRP and you spend $200 on this rye, I hope that you're like, damn, that was a phenomenal rye and worth every penny. If you bought it for $800, I don't know. We didn't price it $800. So don't blame me. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
That's what kind of fascinates me about the model, where you have so much exclusivity and like your supply outstrips your demand so much, of where like, how do you manage the market? How do you price those kinds of things? You even see these legacy producers like Buffalo Trace, where people are secondary market selling Buffalo Trace bourbon. It's a $27 whiskey.
Yeah.
And people will trade it on secondary markets. I think you need to adjust your pricing a bit to meet where the market's at for these things. So it's interesting to hear from someone on the other side of it.
Here's how we think about it. We price stuff based on our acquisition cost and how much we're going to get out of it to the best of our ability. So if we buy barrels for Brook Hill, they're expensive. They're old and they're delicious and they're low yield. So they're not cheap by the nature of those factors. We look to make enough money to make it work. That's the idea. And we're not sitting here trying to price in secondary pricing to what we do, because I just don't think it's fair. I think you buy one of those single barrels from us. You guys would have bought one of those for $90 to $100. I hope you get that bottle and you're like, yeah, that's a great whiskey for that price point. Cask strength, delicious, single barrel, right? Unique and never seen again. So that's the philosophy essentially is that's what we always want you to do. That's where we were the whole time. I think there's a euphoria moment where everybody's like, oh, this should be $200 for a 5-year. We never really bought into that. I think that's coming to a close, maybe justifiably. So we've always been consistent. And if you see something from us that is pricier, it's for a reason. It's because it costs us a lot to get it. And it wasn't easy to do. Pride of Anderson County is probably the most obliteration, but Pride was expensive, right? But it was very expensive for us to get. Took 2 years to get. The yields were crazy low. If that doesn't make sense for you, no problem. Totally get it. Yep. The limited release stuff, you could probably find on a shelf for $70, $75. I think that'll hit pretty hard against other things you could buy for that amount of money that you can find is the idea. Yeah.
Well, tell us about the Exceptional series. I think those are, I had caught my eye initially when seeing the lineup.
Yeah, no, totally. So that's 8-year plus Kentucky products. Every barrel is different, but they're not customized. Whereas what you guys have in your hands are customized with accounts. All the art is done by Pablo's wife, and they're all in that unique style, very inspired by some of the merchant bottling that's gone on. And really what the intent of that is to put some really unique things in those bottles without kind of like preconceptions. Right? So a number of those have been Kentucky straight malts, which there isn't a lot of out there. It's not a single malt. It's 65 malted barley, 35 corn. It's distilled in Kentucky, but it's of significant age and distilled in Kentucky. If you're like, oh, I only like old bourbon from Kentucky, you should try a 15-year-old Kentucky straight malt because it's pretty phenomenal, right? And so for us, a lot of what that series is about is getting people to try things and exposing them in unique ways in a unique package that maybe doesn't look like anything you thought it was. And so I think we got a lot of people trying malts that thought they only like bourbon or what have you. So I think that's a lot of fun.
Do you know Sina Qua Non, the wine producer?
I know the name. Don't know a lot about it.
Your Exceptional series is like essentially the whiskey version of what they do. The bottles almost look identical. They do unique art for each vintage, blending of mainly rare varieties. But I just didn't know if like a la that cultish, like single release kind of thing.
Yeah.
So,
Look, there's a few people who play in that space and we just think it's fun. Here's what we like to do is not do what's expected and get people thinking different. There's a lot of, I think, one track thinking in bourbon and American whiskey, right? And so let's shake things up. You never thought you would think this was that good. And really it is that fucking good. So I think that's a lot of fun. Yeah. But yeah, it's an ongoing series. We've done some picks with it. We're sadly almost done with those Kentucky malts. If you could find them, they're insane. They're really fun. And I think that's a very rare character thing for us. We've got our hands on these things. The youngest is that you could possibly find bottled is 8.5 years old. The oldest is now edging towards 16. Nothing younger, nothing older. It's a project done by somebody in Kentucky who did a project and barely did anything with it. And we found it. We're like, this is insane. Something here. That's kind of like what we do, right? It'll be very sad when we put the last one on a pallet, but I'm sure we'll find something else that's exceedingly interesting that somebody overlooked
fully
somewhere,
mature barrels aside from the ones that you're finishing, or do you guys have a lease space in a rick house, or like where are you keeping these?
We have a bit of both. We have some really cool stuff we bought that we're holding on to. What we realized is that our best way of operating is finding the stuff that we really want at that very moment and moving on it, right? That's the smartest way for us to operate. Because we process a lot of barrels, right? So if you want to hold a bunch of barrels for the next 5-6 years of business, that's a lot of whiskey. We're not a legacy producer. We're not 5 generations in. We like to find things and move them pretty fast, but we've got some stuff we distilled at Barterstown Bourbon Company. We've got some things that we bought a year and a half that are really fun. So there's different things that we have that are got some time that we need to put in, but predominantly we're finding things that are close to ready to go when we get our hands on them.
You're, like you said, still a pretty young project and trying to shake things up and do something maybe that hasn't been done a ton in the last 30 years. What are some elements of the American whiskey or bourbon specific sector of the industry that are like rapidly changing for the better in your perspective, and some things maybe that you're like, man, we really need to get away from doing X?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what is getting better is, I think what happened with the pandemic was like a little ridiculous. So it's like everybody's just buying everything, and there probably wasn't as much thought put into getting stuff out. And look, I can't tell you, we didn't exist until halfway through it. So I can't tell you that we wouldn't have fallen for that trap too. I think people are just throwing stuff out there as fast as they could to keep up with this kind of like artificial demand structure, right? So maybe just being a little more thoughtful about releases and why you're doing it and what they are and do they meet a need. I think that's happening more and will have to happen because I think people are being more choiceful about what purchases they make. And then, look, I have to say, I'd love for people to be less myopic about what they do. I only drink high rye bourbon. It's the only thing I drink and I don't want anything else. Come on, man. Just try this thing, right? After you try it, tell me what you think. But before you try it, just try it. Don't say anything. Don't tell me what you think it's going to be. I've been surprised both ways. I've thought that something reputationally or whatever should be fantastic. That's been mediocre. And I've thought nothing of something conceptually and been amazed by how good it is. So try it side by side and just get away from what
I agree.
You think
I think
is
that's why I get excited going back to a wine side. That's more my background, trying to get my friends to taste a variety that they've never had before and they have no preconceived notions. But for example, I was on a bachelor party recently for some buddies and I was asking them what kind of whiskeys they drink. And one guy's like, yeah, just bourbon. And I was like, do you ever try any ryes or anything else? Like, nope, I just bourbon and he had his 3 brands. And I was like, maybe try something new. But then when we were tasting wines, he's like, what should I have? Should I try this? Tell me what to have. And I'm like, so you are open to trying things, just not this. So it's like,
yeah. It's interesting because spirits are way more like specific for people. Like they drink their thing and that's what they drink. And The rye thing is a perfect example. You're kidding me, dude. Let's say for example, let's say you only drink Four Roses, right? Great. It's fantastic. It's high rye bourbon, but you hate even a Kentucky style rye. So Four Roses at 35%, I think, or whatever rye, right? You hate a 51% rye mash bill. You fucking hate it. Come on, dude. Give me a break. Why don't you try it and just taste the whiskey? Just taste the whiskey. So I think rye is the penultimate example of you're being ridiculous, right? When you say you don't like it, you might not like some ryes. Fair enough. You probably don't like some bourbons too, right? But that's funny.
Also, the progression on like people's learning and discovery of whiskey, if they start with bourbon, is supposed to go bourbon, rye, scotch. And if you don't ever get to rye or scotch, you actually probably don't like whiskey. Is my thought.
Yeah, I agree. Look, again, and I'm very much in the mindset that things are occasion based. Like sometimes, like I'm not in the scotch business, but I appreciate it. Sometimes it's cold, you're hanging out with buddies, catching up. Great time to drink some scotch, right? Like maybe that's not the time to drink XYZ. I don't know. So I think there's environments, there's settings, there's times of the year, times of the day that different spirits make sense more than others. And being open-minded and finding things you like and challenging that, I think is a great thing to do all the time. There's new products all the time.
I think one thing that's really great about your brand, and thanks again for joining us today. It's awesome and thanks for sharing your whiskeys. One of the things that's great about your brand is that people can actually do all of their exploration with you in one sense, right? You're doing like these Kentucky single malts, you're doing bourbons, all this kind of stuff. So if you want to explore whiskey and you don't want to think about what label you're buying, just buy Rare Character all the time. There you go. Have a variation. So
perfect way to end it. Just buy Rare Character.
That's right. Thanks, man. Thanks so much for joining.
Awesome.
Wish you a ton of luck as you continue to grow the project. We'll be following along for sure.
Appreciate you guys. Thanks for having me.
All right, that was our interview with Pete Nevenglosky. I hope you guys will go out and check out some new whiskeys. Reach out to them online. You can find them at rarecharacterwhiskey.com. You can check out all their different offerings. You can contact them. You can shop when they do new releases and explore the brand, see if something resonates with you, and try out some of their single barrel bottlings. All unique, all incredibly interesting, have a story to tell along with them. So special thanks to Pete at Rare Character for joining us, and hope you tune in next week. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.